Have you ever stood in front of everyone you love, wearing a white dress that cost more than your car, only to realize that the person waiting for you at the altar planned to destroy you all along? That's exactly what happened to me. And I need to tell you this story because what I discovered that day changed not just my life, but saved my sister from walking into the same nightmare. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my wedding day became the worst and somehow the best day of my life, all at the same time. I remember standing in that bridal suite, surrounded by my bridesmaids, my hands shaking as I held the bouquet of white roses mixed with lavender, his favorite combination, not mine. And I should have known right then that something was wrong. But I pushed that feeling down deep inside where I'd been pushing so many feelings for the past 2 years. The makeup artist had just finished touching up my lipstick for the third time because I kept biting my lower lip, a nervous habit I'd developed ever since I met Marcus. And my mother kept telling me it was just pre-wedding jitters, that every bride feels this way. But deep in my gut, in that place where we know the truth even when we don't want to admit it, I knew this was different. The truth is, I'd been ignoring red flags for so long that they'd become my normal, like background noise you eventually stop hearing. And I'd convinced myself that love meant compromise, that relationships required sacrifice, that his need to control every aspect of our wedding planning was just him being detail-oriented and involved, not the warning sign it actually was. I met Marcus 3 years before our wedding day at a corporate conference in downtown Chicago, one of those massive events where everyone wears name tags and tries to network while balancing tiny plates of expensive appetizers and glasses of mediocre wine. He was giving a presentation on digital marketing strategies, and I remember being impressed by how confident he seemed, how he commanded the room with this easy charm that made everyone lean in to hear what he had to say next. After his presentation, he found me at the networking mixer, and I was flattered that someone so successful and put together would be interested in me, a junior account manager who was still figuring out her career path and trying to pay off student loans. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, and we barely noticed when the event staff started stacking chairs around us, trying to close down the venue. He asked about my dreams, my goals, my family, and I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. And when he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation, already imagining what our future might look like together. The first few months were magical, or at least they seemed that way at the time, though looking back now with the clarity that only comes from distance and pain, I can see how carefully he was crafting the illusion, like a master puppeteer arranging the strings before the show begins. He would send flowers to my office with handwritten notes that quoted poetry. He remembered every small detail I mentioned in passing. He planned elaborate dates that felt like scenes from romantic movies, and he introduced me to his world of fine dining and weekend getaways and a lifestyle that felt both exciting and slightly uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that are beautiful but don't quite fit right. The first time I noticed something was off, really off, was about 6 months into our relationship when I mentioned wanting to have dinner with my college friends, a monthly tradition we'd maintained for years, and Marcus's face changed in a way that made my stomach drop. It wasn't anger exactly, it was more like disappointment mixed with concern, and he said he worried about me spending time with people who didn't have my best interests at heart, people who were still stuck in their college mindset while I was building a real future with him. He made it sound so reasonable, so caring, like he was protecting me from bad influences, and I found myself canceling on my friends and telling them I was too busy with work, which wasn't entirely a lie because Marcus had started suggesting ways I could be more successful in my career, which always seemed to involve me being less available for other people and more focused on us. When my best friend Emma called to check on me, concerned that I'd been distant, I made excuses and promised to do better, but somehow I never did. And the monthly dinners became quarterly, then twice a year, then just Christmas, and eventually Emma stopped reaching out as much, though I could hear the worry in her voice when we did talk, could hear the questions she wasn't asking about whether I was okay. My relationship with my family started changing too. Subtle shifts at first, like Marcus suggesting we skip my parents' Sunday dinners because he'd had a stressful week and needed quiet time to decompress, or pointing out that my younger sister Jenny was immature and dramatic and maybe not the best influence on me as I was trying to build a more sophisticated life. Jenny and I had always been close, just 2 years apart, and growing up we'd been inseparable, sharing rooms and secrets and dreams about who we'd become when we grew up, and she was the first person I called when Marcus proposed, standing in my childhood bedroom while she jumped up and down with excitement, both of us crying and laughing at the same time. But as the wedding planning progressed, Marcus started making comments about Jenny's involvement, suggesting that she was too young and inexperienced to be my maid of honor, that maybe I should ask his sister Rachel instead, since she had more experience planning elegant events, and I found myself torn between the sister who'd been my best friend my entire life and the man I was planning to marry, the man who seemed so certain about what was right and proper and appropriate. I compromised by asking both of them to be co-maids of honor, thinking this would solve the problem, but it only created more tension, because Marcus would make subtle digs about Jenny's suggestions for the bachelorette party or her choice of dress style, always framed as concern for how things would look in the photos, for my reputation, for our future, and I found myself constantly defending my sister while simultaneously trying to keep the peace with my fiancé. The wedding planning process became this exhausting dance of trying to please everyone while slowly losing track of what I actually wanted. And if someone had asked me what my dream wedding looked like, I'm not sure I could have answered anymore because somewhere along the way, it had stopped being about my dreams and started being about Marcus's vision of perfection. The guest list arguments should have been my breaking point, but I was so deep in the fog of his manipulation that I couldn't see clearly anymore. Marcus insisted we needed to invite over 300 people, mostly his business associates and distant relatives, while cutting down my list to immediate family and a handful of friends. And when I protested, he explained that weddings were important networking opportunities, that these relationships would benefit both our careers, that I was being selfish for putting my personal preferences above our shared future. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, crying over seating charts and feeling like I was losing my mind, wondering how planning what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life had become this nightmare of spreadsheets and politics and constant compromise that somehow always went in his direction. My mother noticed I'd lost weight, that I had dark circles under my eyes, that I seemed anxious and scattered in a way that wasn't like me, but when she asked if everything was okay, I smiled and said, wedding planning was just stressful, that it would all be worth it, that Marcus was being so helpful and involved, and I believed my own lies because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The alternative was admitting that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I was engaged to someone who didn't love me so much as he wanted to own me, to mold me into his perfect accessory, and that thought was so devastating that I pushed it away every time it tried to surface, buried it under layers of rationalization and hope and desperate optimism that everything would get better after the wedding, that once we were married and the stress of planning was over, we'd go back to how things were in those early magical months. The week before the wedding, Marcus moved into my apartment temporarily because he said it would be easier for coordinating the final details, and that week was when I should have run, should have called the whole thing off. But I was so committed to the narrative that everything was fine, that I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. He went through my phone while I was in the shower, and when I came out, he questioned me about texts from a male colleague about a work project, making it seem like I was hiding something inappropriate when it was literally just messages about a client presentation. He criticized my body, suggesting I do a juice cleanse for the last few days before the wedding to look my best in the dress, and when I said I was already at a healthy weight, he sighed and said he just wanted me to look perfect for our special day, that he was only trying to help, and somehow I ended up apologizing to him for being defensive. He rewrote my wedding vows without asking me, saying his version was more eloquent and meaningful, and when I tried to read my original ones, the ones I'd spent weeks writing from my heart, he looked so disappointed that I folded them up and put them away, telling myself it didn't matter what words I said as long as I meant them. Have you ever felt like you're watching your own life from outside your body? Like you're a passenger in your own story, and someone else is driving? That's how I felt that entire week, disconnected and floating and desperately trying to convince myself that this feeling of dread sitting heavy in my chest was just anxiety, just normal pre-wedding nerves that would pass once I walked down that aisle and said I do. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5 a.m. even though I didn't need to be at the venue until noon, and I lay there in the dark, listening to Marcus snoring beside me, and I let myself think the thoughts I'd been avoiding for months. I thought about how I never laughed anymore. Not the real deep belly laughs that used to come so easily. How I'd started second-guessing every word before I spoke. How I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate his moods and reactions. How I'd lost touch with most of my friends, and how my relationship with my family felt strained and distant. I thought about Jenny, my little sister who used to tell me everything, who'd been acting weird and secretive lately, and how Marcus had started paying more attention to her at family gatherings, asking about her life and her plans and her dreams in that same intense way he'd focused on me when we first met, and a cold feeling spread through my chest like ice water. But I pushed it away because surely I was just being paranoid. Surely my fiancé wasn't showing interest in my baby sister. That was crazy. That was the kind of thing that didn't happen in real life. I got up and went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. And I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. This thin, anxious person with worried eyes and shoulders that hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller, trying to take up less space. And I whispered to my reflection, "What are you doing?" But I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did have an answer, but I was too scared to admit it. At the venue, surrounded by flowers and string lights and all the expensive decorations Marcus had insisted on, I went through the motions of getting ready, letting the hairstylist pin my hair into an elaborate updo, letting the makeup artist paint my face, stepping into the designer dress that cost more than 3 months of my rent, and everyone kept telling me how beautiful I looked, how happy I must be, how lucky I was to have found such a successful and devoted man, and I smiled and nodded, and said all the right things while that ice water feeling in my chest grew colder and colder. Jenny helped me with my dress, her hands shaking slightly as she buttoned the tiny pearl buttons up my back, and when I looked at her in the mirror, I saw that she'd been crying, her eyes red despite the makeup, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing. She was just emotional, just so happy for me, but her voice cracked when she said it, and I knew she was lying. I took her hands and asked her again, really asked her, "What's wrong, Jenny? What aren't you telling me?" And she looked at me with this expression of pure anguish and said, "I can't tell you, not today, not right before your wedding." And I felt that cold feeling turn to ice, sharp and painful in my chest, and I said, "Tell me anyway. Tell me right now." But before she could answer, Marcus's sister Rachel came in and said it was almost time, that the photographer needed us for pre-ceremony photos. And the moment was lost, but Jenny squeezed my hand hard and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Sarah, I'm so sorry," and then she was gone, pulled away by Rachel, who was chattering about the schedule and the timeline and making sure everything was perfect. The pre-ceremony photos were torture. Standing there with my bouquet and my forced smile while Marcus posed next to me looking triumphant, like he'd won some kind of prize. And I realized with sudden horrible clarity that that's exactly how he saw this. Not as the beginning of a partnership, but as an acquisition, as the successful completion of a project. And I was the project. The photographer kept saying, "Smile bigger, look happier, this is your wedding day." And I wanted to scream that I couldn't, that something was terribly wrong, that I needed everyone to stop and listen to me. But I didn't. I just smiled bigger and looked at the camera and played my part in the elaborate show Marcus had orchestrated. When it was finally time to walk down the aisle, my father took my arm and asked if I was ready. And I almost said no, almost told him everything, almost begged him to take me away from there. But I looked up and saw 300 people seated and waiting, saw Marcus standing at the altar looking confident and pleased, saw all the money that had been spent and all the planning that had gone into this day. And I thought about the embarrassment of calling it off now, about disappointing everyone, about being the girl who couldn't go through with it. And I said, "Yes, Dad, I'm ready." And he kissed my cheek and told me he loved me, and he was proud of me. And I wanted to cry because I knew I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but I couldn't figure out how to stop it. The walk down the aisle felt like walking to my own execution, each step taking me closer to a future I didn't want but couldn't escape. And I looked at the faces watching me, people smiling and crying happy tears, and I wanted to tell them all that this was wrong, that they were witnessing not a celebration, but a tragedy in progress. But I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until I reached the altar and my father placed my hand in Marcus's and stepped back, and I was alone with the man I was about to promise my life to, and his hand was cold and his grip was tight, too tight, possessive rather than loving. And I looked into his eyes and saw something there that made my blood run cold, a kind of calculated satisfaction, like he'd been planning this moment for a long time and everything was going exactly according to his design. The officiant began speaking, talking about love and commitment and partnership, words that should have been beautiful but felt hollow and meaningless in that moment. And I barely heard him because I was too busy having a full-scale panic attack while trying to look calm and happy, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode, my palms sweating, my vision starting to tunnel, and I realized I was going to pass out, I was going to faint right there at the altar in front of 300 people. And maybe that would be for the best because then someone would have to stop this. Someone would have to postpone and give me time to think, time to escape. But I didn't faint. I stayed conscious through sheer force of will. And the ceremony continued, and we got to the vows, and Marcus pulled out a paper and began reading the vows he'd written, beautiful words about love and devotion and building a life together. And everyone was crying and smiling, and I was supposed to be touched, supposed to be moved, but all I could think was that these words were a performance, a script he was delivering for the audience, and none of it was real. Then it was my turn, and I pulled out the vows he'd written for me, the ones I was supposed to read. But instead, I found myself pulling out the original vows I'd written, the ones I'd hidden in my bouquet at the last minute without really knowing why, some instinct telling me to keep them close, and I started reading them, my real vows, the ones that talked about partnership and equality, and maintaining our individual identities while building something together. And I saw Marcus's face change, saw anger flash in his eyes for just a second before he covered it with a smile, and I knew I'd deviated from his script. I'd done something he hadn't planned for, and that small act of defiance gave me just enough courage to keep going. But then something happened that I wasn't prepared for, something that changed everything. As I was finishing my vows, I saw Jenny stand up from her seat in the front row, and she was crying, really crying, and she said, "Stop. Please, Sarah, stop." And everyone turned to look at her, confused and shocked, and Marcus's face went dark with rage barely contained, and Jenny walked up to the altar with her phone in her hand, shaking and crying. And she said, "I'm so sorry, Sarah, but I can't let you do this. I can't let you marry him." And she held up her phone and showed me a screenshot of text messages between her and Marcus, messages that made my stomach drop and my world tilt sideways, because they were romantic messages, flirtatious messages where Marcus had been telling my baby sister that he cared about her, that he felt a connection with her, that maybe he'd chosen the wrong sister. And the messages were dated from the past 6 months, the entire time we'd been engaged, and I stood there reading them while 300 people whispered and murmured, and Marcus started to speak, started to say it was all a misunderstanding, that Jenny had misinterpreted friendly messages, but I kept reading, kept scrolling through message after message, where he'd been grooming my sister the same way he'd groomed me, setting her up to be his next victim. And I realized with absolute crystal clarity that this was his pattern. This was what he did. He found vulnerable women, and he manipulated them, and he controlled them. And when he was done with one, he moved on to the next, and my sister was supposed to be next. And this wedding, this elaborate, expensive performance, was never about loving me. It was about breaking me, about crushing my spirit so completely that I would be too damaged to ever tell anyone what he'd done. And then he could move on to Jenny with me as a cautionary tale, a broken ex-wife who couldn't hold it together. And no one would believe me if I tried to warn them about him. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A hot, bright fury that burned away the fear and the doubt and the people-pleasing conditioning that had kept me trapped for so long. I turned to Marcus and I said, "Is this true? Did you send these messages to my sister?" And he tried to lie, tried to manipulate, tried to spin it into something innocent, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, could see him trying to figure out how to salvage this, how to regain control of the narrative, and I realized he thought he could still win, still convince everyone that this was a misunderstanding, that Jenny was unstable or jealous or lying. And that's when I understood that I had to fight back, had to expose him not just for my sake, but for Jenny's sake, for the sake of whoever his next victim might be, if I didn't stop him right now, right here, in front of all these witnesses who could see the truth, if I was brave enough to show it to them. I took a step back from Marcus, and I said in a voice that carried through the entire room, "This wedding is over." And he reached for me, tried to grab my arm, tried to pull me back under his control. And I yanked away and said, "Don't you dare touch me." And I turned to face all those people, 300 faces staring at me in shock and confusion. And I said, "I need to tell you all something. I need you to know what kind of man you're here to celebrate today." And Marcus was saying, "Sarah, don't do this. You're upset. You're confused. Let's talk about this privately." But I ignored him and I told them everything. I told them about the isolation, about how he'd systematically cut me off from my friends and family, about the control and the manipulation and the constant criticism disguised as concern. I told them about the red flags I'd ignored, about the times he'd made me feel crazy for questioning his behavior, about how he'd rewritten my vows and controlled every aspect of our wedding planning and made me feel like my opinions and preferences didn't matter. I told them about the weight loss and the anxiety and the feeling of walking on eggshells, about how I'd lost myself trying to become the person he wanted me to be. And then I told them about Jenny, about the messages, about how he'd been grooming my 19-year-old sister while planning to marry me, about how I believed this was his pattern. that I probably wasn't the first woman he'd done this to, and if I didn't stop him now, I wouldn't be the last. My mother was crying. My father was standing up looking like he wanted to kill Marcus with his bare hands. My friends were gasping and murmuring, and Marcus was standing there with his perfect mask finally cracking, unable to control the narrative anymore, unable to manipulate his way out of this because the truth was out there for everyone to see, documented in those text messages on Jenny's phone, visible in my weight loss and my anxiety, and the haunted look that I'd been carrying for months. Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire life pivots, where you make a choice that you know will change everything, where you step off a cliff not knowing if you'll fall or fly? That's what it felt like standing there at that altar, destroying my own wedding, ruining what was supposed to be the perfect day, but somehow feeling freer and stronger than I'd felt in years. Marcus tried to salvage it, of course he did, because men like him don't give up easily, don't accept defeat gracefully. He raised his voice and said I was having a breakdown, that the stress of wedding planning had made me unstable, that I was believing lies from my jealous sister who'd always been possessive of me, and he was so convincing, so smooth, that I saw some people in the audience nodding along, starting to believe him, and I realized this was the crucial moment. This was when I either fought back hard enough to make people see the truth, or I let him win, let him spin this into a narrative where I was, the crazy one, where Jenny was the troublemaker, where he was the victim of two unstable sisters who'd ruined his special day. I looked at Jenny and I saw the terror in her eyes, the fear that people would believe him, that she'd be blamed for this, that her confession would be twisted into something ugly. And I knew I had to be stronger than I'd ever been before, braver than I thought possible, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting my sister from the same fate I'd almost suffered. So I pulled out my own phone. Thank God I'd kept it with me, even though Marcus had suggested I leave it in the bridal suite, and I opened my photo gallery where I'd been documenting things without even really realizing why. Screenshots of his controlling messages, photos of myself from 6 months ago compared to now showing the dramatic weight loss, journal entries I'd typed late at night when I couldn't sleep, documenting incidents that seemed small individually, but together painted a clear picture of psychological abuse, and I started showing people, passing my phone around, letting them see the evidence that this wasn't a breakdown or jealousy or lies. This was real. This was happening. This was the truth. Marcus's sister Rachel was the first one to turn on him, to my surprise, and she stood up and said she'd suspected something was wrong, that she'd seen how he treated me during wedding planning, how controlling he was, how dismissive of my opinions, but she'd told herself it was just stress, just the pressure of planning a big event, and she apologized for not speaking up sooner, for enabling him by staying silent. Then one of Marcus's college friends stood up, a guy named David, and he said he needed to confess something too, that Marcus had done this before, that there'd been another girlfriend in college who'd ended up hospitalized for a nervous breakdown after dating Marcus for a year, and David had always felt guilty for not warning me, for not saying something when Marcus and I started dating, and he was sorry, so deeply sorry, and his voice broke when he said it. More people started speaking up, sharing small observations and concerns they'd had, pieces of a puzzle that alone seemed insignificant but together created a clear picture of who Marcus really was, and I watched as his carefully constructed image crumbled, as the mask he'd worn for so long finally shattered completely, and underneath was something ugly and angry and desperate, and he looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You stupid bitch, you've ruined everything. I spent 2 years on you. 2 years building you up just to break you down, and you couldn't even let me have my moment. You couldn't even do this one thing right." And his words, his raw, honest, horrible words, proved everything I'd been saying, showed everyone exactly who he was, and my father and 2 of my uncles stepped forward and escorted him out of the venue, while he screamed threats and insults and promises that I'd regret this, that he'd destroy me, that no one would believe me, that I was nothing without him. The venue cleared out quickly after that, 300 people gathering their belongings and leaving in small shocked groups, whispering and processing what they'd just witnessed, and I stood there in my wedding dress surrounded by flowers and decorations that had cost thousands of dollars, supposed symbols of love and celebration that now felt like props in a play that had gone horribly wrong. Except it hadn't gone wrong. It had gone right, because I'd stopped it. I'd saved myself. I'd saved Jenny. And even though I was shaking and crying and probably in shock, I also felt something else, something unexpected. I felt proud. Jenny ran to me and threw her arms around me and sobbed into my shoulder, saying she was so sorry she should have told me sooner. She'd been so scared and confused, Marcus had made her feel special and seen and then started making her feel crazy, the same pattern he'd used on me. And she'd finally realized what was happening when he'd sent her a message the night before the wedding, saying that soon I'd be his wife, but she could be his soulmate, that after the wedding he'd start the process of divorcing me and then they could be together. And that's when she knew she had to stop it, had to tell me even if it meant ruining my wedding day. Because better to ruin a wedding than to let me marry someone who was already planning my destruction. I held my baby sister and told her she'd saved me, that she was the bravest person I knew, that she had nothing to apologize for, that Marcus was the villain in this story, not her, and we cried together surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, except in a weird way it was becoming that. Not in the way I'd imagined, but in a way that was real and true and meaningful. My parents came over, my mother's face streaked with tears and mascara, my father looking shaken and furious, and they apologized for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting me better, for being so caught up in the excitement of the wedding that they'd missed the signs that their daughter was drowning. I told them it wasn't their fault, that Marcus was a master manipulator, that he'd fooled everyone including me, that the important thing was that we all saw clearly now, that we could all move forward with the truth out in the open. My mom suggested we go somewhere private, get out of the venue, but I said no, I wanted to stay just a little longer, wanted to stand in this space where I'd almost made the worst mistake of my life but hadn't, where I'd found the courage to save myself, wanted to remember this feeling of strength even though I was terrified and heartbroken and overwhelmed. Emma, my best friend who I'd pushed away during my relationship with Marcus, came rushing over, and she'd clearly been crying, and she said she was so proud of me, so relieved, that she'd been so worried for so long, that she'd wanted to say something but hadn't known how, hadn't wanted to be the friend who criticized my relationship and lost me altogether. And I told her I understood, that I was sorry for pushing her away, that I wanted to rebuild our friendship if she'd let me, and she hugged me and said, of course, always, that's what best friends do. They wait for each other to find their way back. Have you ever felt like you've been holding your breath for so long that when you finally exhale, you realize you'd forgotten what it felt like to really breathe? That's how I felt in that moment, surrounded by the people who actually loved me, free from the man who'd been slowly suffocating me with his control and manipulation. And even though everything was a mess and I had no idea what came next, I could breathe, really breathe, for the first time in 2 years. The next few days were chaos, canceling the honeymoon, returning wedding gifts, dealing with the venue and the vendors, and explaining what had happened over and over again to people who were shocked and supportive, and sometimes judgmental, because there were people who said I should have figured it out sooner, who implied I was weak or stupid for not seeing the signs, who questioned why I'd let it get so far, and those comments stung, made me doubt myself all over again, made me wonder if they were right, if I was to blame for my own manipulation. But then I'd remember Marcus's face when his mask slipped. I'd remember the hatred in his voice. I'd remember the text messages he'd sent to Jenny, and I'd realize that none of this was my fault, that I was a victim of psychological abuse, that manipulation works precisely because it's subtle and gradual and makes you doubt your own reality, and that recognizing it and escaping it didn't make me weak. It made me strong, maybe the strongest I'd ever been. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen, who specialized in emotional abuse and narcissistic relationships, and she helped me understand the patterns, helped me see how Marcus had used classic manipulation tactics, love bombing at the beginning to hook me, then gradually isolating me and eroding my self-esteem, gaslighting me when I questioned his behavior, making me feel responsible for his emotions and reactions. And she said what I'd done at the wedding, exposing him in front of all those people, was incredibly brave because it's so much easier and safer to just go along, to not make waves, to protect the abuser's image out of fear or conditioning or hope that things will get better. And by speaking up, by telling the truth publicly, I'd not only saved myself and Jenny, but potentially saved future victims because now Marcus's behavior was on record, was known to his friends and family and business associates, and that would make it much harder for him to successfully manipulate someone else. Jenny started therapy too, processing her own trauma from Marcus's grooming, dealing with the guilt she felt for not telling me sooner, even though Dr. Chen explained that this guilt was misplaced, that Marcus had manipulated her just as he'd manipulated me, that the only person responsible for his actions was Marcus himself. Jenny and I grew closer than we'd been in years, spending long evenings together talking and crying and laughing and healing, and she told me that watching me stand up at that altar and expose Marcus had shown her what real strength looked like, that she wanted to be that brave, that honest, that willing to fight for herself and the people she loved. We made a pact, my sister and I, that we would never again ignore red flags in relationships, that we would trust our instincts, that we would support each other in speaking up when something felt wrong, that we would choose our own well-being over other people's comfort or expectations. And it sounds simple, but for both of us, it was revolutionary. This idea that we deserved to take up space, to have opinions, to set boundaries, to be valued for who we actually were rather than who someone else wanted us to be. My parents were struggling too, processing their own guilt and fear, questioning how they'd missed the signs, beating themselves up for being so excited about the wedding that they hadn't noticed their daughter was suffering. And I had to keep reassuring them that it wasn't their fault, that Marcus was skilled at presenting one face in public and another in private, that even I hadn't fully understood what was happening until that moment at the altar when everything became crystal clear. About 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, Emma threw me a divorce party. Even though I'd never actually gotten married, she said I was divorcing the person I'd pretended to be while with Marcus, divorcing the fear and anxiety and self-doubt that he'd planted in me, celebrating my freedom and my courage and my new beginning. She invited all my old friends, the ones I'd pushed away or lost touch with during my relationship, and they came, all of them, with cards and gifts and love and support, and we spent the evening sharing stories and laughing and crying, and they told me they'd missed me, the real me, the person who used to laugh so easily and speak her mind and take risks and try new things, and they said they could see her coming back, could see me emerging from the shell I'd built around myself, and it made me realize how much I'd lost during those 2 years, how much of myself I'd sacrificed trying to be what Marcus wanted, and also how much I had to look forward to, all the parts of myself I could reclaim and rebuild, and maybe even reimagine into something better and stronger than before. We burned my wedding dress that night, which might seem dramatic but felt necessary, felt cathartic, standing around Emma's backyard fire pit, watching the expensive designer gown go up in flames while my friends cheered and toasted to new beginnings. And as I watched the white fabric turn to ash, I felt something shift inside me, felt the last threads of attachment to Marcus and to the person I'd tried to be for him finally burn away, leaving space for something new to grow. I threw myself into rebuilding my life with an intensity that surprised me, reconnecting with friends, repairing relationships with family members I'd neglected, pursuing hobbies and interests I'd abandoned because Marcus had found them silly or unimportant. I started painting again, something I'd loved in college but had stopped doing because Marcus said it was a waste of time, that I should focus on more practical pursuits. And I discovered that I'd missed it terribly, missed the feeling of creating something with my own hands, expressing emotions through color and form rather than words. I joined a book club with Emma and some other friends, reading novels that Marcus would have dismissed as frivolous, staying up late discussing characters and themes and losing myself in stories that weren't my own. I started running. Early morning runs through my neighborhood where I could think and process and feel my body getting stronger, feel my mind getting clearer, and sometimes I'd run until I was exhausted and crying and gasping for air, purging all the fear and anger and shame I'd been carrying, and then I'd walk home feeling lighter, feeling more like myself. I changed jobs too, leaving the company where I'd worked during my relationship with Marcus because too many people there knew him, knew us, and I couldn't rebuild my professional identity in a place where I was still defined by him, still seen as the girl who had a wedding disaster, and I found a position at a smaller firm where no one knew my history, where I could be just Sarah, competent and capable and worthy on my own terms, and it was terrifying and exhilarating and exactly what I needed. The legal aftermath was complicated and draining, dealing with Marcus's attempts to sue me for emotional distress and defamation, claiming I'd publicly humiliated him and damaged his reputation, and my lawyer had to patiently explain that truth is a defense against defamation, that I hadn't lied about anything, that the text messages and witness testimonies supported everything I'd said, and eventually his lawsuit was dismissed, but not before costing me thousands of dollars in legal fees and countless hours of anxiety and fear that somehow he'd find a way to make me pay for exposing him. He tried other tactics too, showing up at my apartment building until I got a restraining order, sending me long emails alternating between apologies and threats, contacting my employer to make complaints about my professional conduct. And each incident was a reminder that leaving an abusive relationship doesn't end the abuse. It just changes the form. And the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, constantly protecting yourself from someone who can't accept that they've lost control over you. My therapist helped me understand that this was his last-ditch effort to maintain power, that if he couldn't control me through the relationship, he'd try to control me through fear and legal intimidation, and that the best response was to document everything, report violations of the restraining order, and refused to engage with him directly no matter how much he tried to provoke a response. Jenny struggled with her own version of this, dealing with Marcus's attempts to contact her, his messages saying she'd misunderstood him, that he'd really cared about her, that if she'd just talked to him they could clear everything up, and it took all her strength and the support of her therapist to block him on every platform and refuse to respond, to recognize that any engagement would just give him an opening to manipulate her again. We were both learning, my sister and I, that healing from psychological abuse isn't linear, that there are good days and bad days, days when we felt strong and confident and proud of ourselves for escaping, and days when we felt guilty and confused and wondered if we'd overreacted, if things had really been that bad, if maybe we should have tried harder to make it work, and on those days we'd talk to each other, remind each other of the reality of what happened, of the evidence we had, of the relief we felt when we were finally free from his control. Dr. Chen explained that this doubt was normal, that abuse victims often question themselves even after escaping, because that's what abuse does. It makes you doubt your own perceptions, your own reality, your own worth. And that healing meant learning to trust ourselves again, to believe our own memories and feelings and instincts, to know that we deserved better than what we'd accepted. About 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, I got a message from a woman named Rachel, different from Marcus's sister. This Rachel said she'd been engaged to Marcus 4 years ago, that she'd left him a month before their wedding after realizing how controlling and manipulative he was. But she'd never spoken publicly about it, had been too embarrassed and ashamed, and when she heard what happened at my wedding through mutual friends, she wanted to reach out and tell me I'd done the right thing, that I'd been braver than she was, and that hearing my story had helped her finally process her own experience and realize it wasn't her fault. We met for coffee and spent 3 hours comparing notes, discovering eerily similar patterns in how Marcus had behaved, the same tactics, the same progression from charming to controlling, the same targeting of younger female relatives, and Rachel cried when I told her about Jenny, said she'd had a teenage cousin that Marcus had shown interest in during their engagement, and she'd always wondered if he would have gone after her if Rachel had married him, and now she knew the answer. We exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, and Rachel said she was thinking about writing about her experience, maybe posting on social media or even writing an article, because the more she learned about emotional abuse and narcissistic behavior patterns, the more she realized how common this was. How many women had similar stories but stayed silent out of shame or fear, or the belief that no one would understand or care. She asked if I'd be willing to share my story too, to add my voice to hers, to create a record that might help other women recognize the warning signs before it was too late. And I said yes, absolutely yes, because if my nightmare could help even one person escape their own, if Jenny's bravery in speaking up could inspire someone else to do the same, then maybe some good could come from all this pain. We started a blog together, Rachel and I, anonymously at first because we were still scared of Marcus's retaliation. But as more women reached out with their own stories, as we realized we weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't weak, we decided to use our real names, to own our stories, to refuse to hide in shame when we'd done nothing wrong. The blog grew beyond what we'd imagined. Women from all over the country sharing their experiences with emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, control disguised as love, and the common threads were striking. The same patterns showing up over and over, love bombing followed by isolation, followed by criticism, followed by gaslighting, the gradual erosion of self-esteem, the constant feeling of walking on eggshells, the confusion of feeling like you're going crazy while everyone else sees. Your partner is perfect and charming and wonderful. We created resources, lists of warning signs, advice for leaving safely, links to therapists and support groups and legal aid, and we heard from women who said our blog had saved them, had helped them see their situation clearly, had given them the courage to leave, and those messages kept us going even when it was hard, even when writing about our own experiences brought up painful memories, even when Marcus and men like him tried to discredit us, calling us bitter and vindictive and unstable. Have you ever turned your pain into purpose, your trauma into advocacy, your worst experience into something that might help others? That's what Rachel and I were doing, and it didn't erase what happened to us, didn't make it okay, but it gave it meaning, gave us a way to fight back not just for ourselves, but for all the women who were still trapped, still suffering, still blaming themselves for someone else's cruelty. Jenny got involved too, writing a guest post about her experience being groomed by her sister's fiancé, about the confusion and guilt and fear she'd felt, about the courage it took to speak up, and her post went viral, shared thousands of times, because people responded to her honesty, her vulnerability, her youth, and they understood that predators don't just target romantic partners, they target anyone vulnerable in their victim's orbit, and that protecting yourself sometimes means protecting others even when it's terrifying and difficult and costs you something. Jenny started speaking at colleges about recognizing manipulation in relationships, about trusting your instincts, about the difference between healthy concern and controlling behavior, and watching my little sister transform her trauma into activism made me so proud I could barely breathe, made me grateful all over again that I'd found the courage to stop that wedding, to save us both from years or decades of ongoing abuse. My parents came to one of Jenny's talks, and my mother cried through the whole thing, hearing her daughter speak so honestly about what she'd been through. And afterward, she told Jenny and me that she was sorry. So sorry she hadn't protected us better, hadn't taught us better about what love should look like. And we told her that she had taught us, that the love she and Dad showed us, the respect and partnership and equality in their marriage, was exactly why we'd both ultimately recognized that what Marcus offered wasn't love, it was control, and we'd learned to see the difference. And that was her gift to us, that foundation of real love that helped us identify the counterfeit. I started dating again eventually, cautiously and carefully, with very clear boundaries and a much better understanding of red flags. And it was terrifying at first, wondering if I could trust my judgment, if I'd fall into the same patterns, if I'd miss the warning signs again. But Dr. Chen reminded me that I wasn't the same person I was when I met Marcus, that I'd grown and learned and developed skills for recognizing manipulation, and that I needed to trust myself, trust the work I'd done in therapy, trust that I deserved a healthy relationship with someone who valued me for who I actually was. I went on some bad dates, some mediocre dates, some dates with perfectly nice men who just weren't right for me, and I learned that it was okay to say no, to not force something that didn't feel right, to walk away without guilt or explanation when my instincts told me this wasn't it. I learned that I could be alone and be happy, that I didn't need a relationship to validate my worth or complete my life, that I was whole on my own. And that's when I met Alex, not when I was desperately searching, but when I was content with myself, confident in my boundaries, clear about what I wanted and what I wouldn't accept. Alex was different from the beginning, respectful of my time and space, interested in my opinions and passions, supportive of my work with the blog and my activism around emotional abuse awareness. And he never tried to change me or control me or make me smaller. He encouraged me to take up more space, to be louder, to pursue my goals with everything I had. And I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to reveal himself as another Marcus. But it never happened because he was just a good person who'd done his own work in therapy, who had healthy relationships modeled for him growing up, who understood that love was about adding to someone's life, not subtracting from it. It's been 3 years now since the wedding that wasn't. 3 years of healing and growing and learning and fighting and building a life that's truly mine, not a performance for someone else, not a compromise that leaves me depleted, not a prison disguised as love. Jenny is thriving, graduated from college with honors, in a healthy relationship with someone who treats her with the respect and kindness she deserves. And she credits our experience with Marcus, as painful as it was, with teaching her what to look for and what to avoid in a partner. My relationship with my parents is stronger than ever, built on honesty and communication that wasn't there before when we all assumed everything was fine without really asking, without really looking. My friendships have deepened, rooted in authenticity rather than the surface-level interactions I'd maintained while with Marcus. And I've learned that real friends don't just celebrate with you, they show up when things fall apart. They tell you hard truths when you need to hear them. They wait patiently for you to find your way back to yourself. The blog Rachel and I started has become a nonprofit organization with a small staff and real funding, providing resources and support to survivors of emotional abuse, and we've helped hundreds of women leave dangerous situations, find therapists, navigate the legal system, rebuild their lives, and knowing that my worst day became the catalyst for helping others makes it all mean something, makes the pain worth it in a way I never could have imagined standing at that altar 3 years ago. I think about Marcus sometimes, wonder what he's doing, whether he's found another victim or whether enough people know his patterns now that he's had to change his approach, and I'm told through mutual acquaintances that he's moved to another city, started over somewhere fresh where people don't know his history, and I worry about the women he might target there. But I also know I can't save everyone, can only control my own actions, my own choices, my own voice, and I use that voice loudly. and often sharing my story whenever someone will listen, hoping it reaches the woman who needs to hear it, who's making excuses for her partner's controlling behavior, who's wondering if she's overreacting, who's scared to leave because it seems too hard or too embarrassing or too final. I want to tell her, want to tell all of them, that leaving is hard, but staying is harder, that short-term pain is better than long-term destruction, that they deserve so much more than they're accepting, that love shouldn't make you smaller or quieter or more anxious. It should make you more fully yourself, more confident, more joyful, more alive. I want to tell them that if I could stand at that altar in front of 300 people and blow up my own wedding and survive, even thrive, then they can do hard things too. They can trust their instincts. They can choose themselves. They can walk away from people who hurt them, no matter how charming or successful or convincing those people might be. So here's what I want you to take away from my story, whether you've been through something similar or you know someone who has, or you're just trying to understand how these things happen to smart, capable, strong people who should know better. And first of all, throw away that should know better thinking, because manipulation doesn't care how smart you are. It works precisely because it's gradual and subtle and designed to make you doubt yourself. The warning signs of an emotionally abusive relationship include a partner who isolates you from friends and family, who criticizes you constantly while framing it as concern, who makes you feel responsible for their emotions, who gaslights you by denying things you clearly remember happening, who love-bombed you at the beginning with overwhelming attention and affection, who makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells, who controls your finances or your schedule or your appearance, who punishes you with silence or anger when you don't comply with their wishes, who makes you feel crazy for having normal emotional responses to their behavior. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in these patterns, please know that it's not your fault, that you're not weak or stupid or broken, that you're dealing with someone who's deliberately manipulating you and you deserve help and support to get out safely. I also want to talk to the people who love someone in an abusive relationship, because I know how frustrating it is to watch someone you care about stay with someone who's clearly hurting them, and you want to shake them and make them see what you see. But here's what I learned from my friends who stood by me. Isolation works when people give up and walk away. So don't do that. Stay connected even when it's hard, even when the person pushes you away. Keep showing up. Keep offering support. Without judgment, let them know that when they're ready to leave, you'll be there. And don't say, "I told you so," when they finally see the truth, because shame and embarrassment are huge barriers to leaving, and you don't want to add to that burden. When Jenny showed me those text messages at the altar, she wasn't saying, "I told you so." She was saying, "I see you, I love you, I'm here to help you." And that's what gave me the courage to act. Be that person for someone. Be the one who sees clearly when they can't, who holds space for their truth even when they're not ready to accept it, who celebrates their strength when they finally choose themselves. And if you're someone who's already left, who's in the healing process, who's struggling with the aftermath and wondering if it will ever get easier, I want to tell you that it does. Not all at once, not in a straight line, but slowly, gradually. You'll notice one day that you went a whole week without thinking about them, that you made a decision without second-guessing yourself into paralysis, that you laughed without that undercurrent of anxiety, that you felt genuinely happy rather than just not sad. And those moments will multiply, will build on each other, until you realize you've built a whole new life, a real life, a life that's authentically yours. You'll realize that the person you were in that relationship wasn't weak. She was surviving, doing the best she could with the information and resources she had. And the person you are now is stronger for having survived it, more compassionate, more aware, more able to recognize manipulation and set boundaries and trust yourself. The trauma doesn't disappear completely, doesn't just evaporate because you left, but it becomes integrated into your story rather than defining your story. Becomes something that happened to you rather than something that is you. And you'll find ways to use it, to help others, to advocate for change, to refuse to be silent about something that affects so many people but remains hidden because of shame and stigma, and the misconception that abuse has to be physical, to be real. I want to end by saying thank you. Thank you for listening to my story, for spending this time with me, for opening your mind and heart to understanding something that's uncomfortable and painful, and unfortunately all too common. And if my story resonated with you, if it touched something in your own experience or helped you understand someone you love or simply made you more aware of the subtle ways abuse can manifest, please comment below and let me know. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so, because every story told is another woman who realizes she's not alone, not crazy, not at fault. And that's powerful. That's how we change the narrative. That's how we save lives. If you found value in this video, if you think it's important for more people to hear stories like mine, please hit that like button because it helps the algorithm show this video to more people who might need it, and please subscribe to I Live to Tell because we share stories of survival and resilience and hope. Stories of people who've been through hell and came out the other side stronger. Stories that remind us that we're capable of more than we think, that we can survive things we never thought we'd have to face, that our worst moments don't define us, but our response to them does. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories, because I promise you, every single one has the power to change a life, maybe even your own. And remember, if you're in a situation that doesn't feel right, that makes you anxious or scared or small, trust that feeling, trust yourself, reach out for help, whether that's a friend or a family member or a therapist or a domestic violence hotline, and know that leaving is possible, that you deserve better, that there's a whole life waiting for you on the other side of that fear. A life where you get to be fully yourself, where you're valued and respected and loved for exactly who you are. And I promise it's worth fighting for. It's worth the temporary pain of leaving. It's worth rebuilding from scratch, because freedom, real freedom to be yourself without fear or control or manipulation, is the most precious thing in the world, and you deserve it. Every single one of you deserves it. And I hope my story helps you believe that, helps you find the courage to take that first step, helps you know that you're not alone and you never will be, because there's a whole community of survivors out there ready to support you, ready to celebrate you, ready to remind you that you're strong and brave and worthy of so much more than you've been accepting.